I came home for Thanksgiving. Found my son sleeping in a car. A note on my door. We're going to Italy. He's not welcome. Deal with your mistake. He wasn't upset. He smiled and said, Dad, Grandma left her bag opened. I found this. He handed me an envelope. I read for 2 minutes. Then I smiled. Revenge will taste sweet. Their flight landed to A. But before I begin, I want to make an important announcement about our channel. For the past 5 months, our channel has not been monetized, which means I'm not earning any money from YouTube ads. There are currently no ads running on our videos. Because of this, I also have to work another job, which makes it difficult for me to upload videos daily. If you enjoy our content and want to support the channel, please consider donating just $1. $1 may seem small, but if everyone supports together, it can make a huge difference and help keep this channel active. Your support will help me spend more time creating stories and uploading videos consistently instead of working another job. Of course, you can donate any amount you would like, and every donation truly helps and means a lot to me. To support the channel, please click the donation link in the video description or pinned comment. You can also scan the QR code shown on the screen to donate quickly and easily. Thank you so much for supporting. Now, let's dive into today's story. The snow had been falling over Millbrook, Ohio since late afternoon, quiet and relentless, the kind that buried everything slowly and without announcement. It covered the sagging gutters on old brick houses, packed itself into the grooves of empty parking lots, and settled over the rusted skeleton of the old textile mill at the edge of town that hadn't run a shift in 11 years. Millbrook was the kind of place that stayed alive out of stubbornness more than prosperity. The factories had gone first, then the good-paying jobs, then the young people who had better options elsewhere. What remained was a town of hard workers and long memories, people who kept their heat on through February and called that a good year. Brennan Cole had been away from Millbrook for 10 days. He had spent those 10 days in Indiana, working for the utility company on a storm damage response crew. A late November ice storm had taken down power lines across 3 counties, and crews had been dispatched from Ohio to help with the backlog. Brennan was one of the senior linemen. He climbed frozen poles in temperatures that dropped below 10 degrees before dawn, worked in the dark with headlamps, ate vending machine food in the cab of a service truck, and did the kind of physical labor that left a man's hands raw and aching for days after. He had done this kind of work for 12 years. He was good at it. He never complained about the cold or the hours, because complaining didn't warm anything up and it didn't get the work done any faster. But 10 days was a long time to be away from his son. Noah was 7. He was at the age where 10 days felt enormous, long enough for the world to shift a little, long enough for small things to become large ones in a child's imagination. Brennan had called every evening from Indiana, sometimes from the truck, sometimes from motel bathroom, so the noise of the other guys playing cards in the main room didn't drown out his voice. Noah always sounded fine on the phone. Fine was the word that would haunt Brennan later. He pulled his work truck on a Crestline drive just after 9 in the evening, Thanksgiving night. The neighborhood was quiet the way it always was after the holiday. Porch lights burning, amber through the snow, with smoke drifting in thin columns from chimneys up and down the block, the distant sound of a television behind a closed curtain. Normal, familiar, the particular piece of a neighborhood that had eaten well and gone indoors. Except when he pulled up in front of his own house, the porch light was off. He sat there for a moment with the engine still running, staring at the dark front face of the house. It was a small thing. A person who didn't know Vivian wouldn't have noticed it. But Vivian was meticulous about the porch light the way she was meticulous about anything visible from the street. She left it on every evening without fail, not for warmth or safety, but because it was the kind of thing the neighbors could see and judge, and Vivian cared enormously about what the neighbors saw and judged. The porch light was always on when Brennan came home. It had been on every single time for 3 years. He cut the engine. The quiet that replaced the truck's rumble felt different than usual. Heavier. He grabbed his duffel bag from the passenger seat. and walked across the snow-covered yard to the front door. The snow was 6 inches deep here, undisturbed. No footprints on the porch steps. No tire tracks in the driveway approaching from the direction of street. The house had the particular stillness of a place that had been empty long enough for the air to settle. He noticed a note when he reached the top porch step. A folded piece of paper, taped at all four corners against the center panel of the door. White against dark wood. Vivian's handwriting. He pulled it free and unfolded it under the thin light that reached from the street. We went to Italy. Your son is your problem now. Deal with your mistake. He read it twice. The second time, more slowly. His mind turned the words over with the same careful attention he gave to a connection point on a live line, checking every part of it, making sure he understood the full structure before deciding what to do next. The phrase "your son" told him more than any single sentence had a right to. Your son, not our son, not even Noah's name. Just a pronoun designed to push ownership across a line, to say clearly that whatever happened next was not her concern and had perhaps never been her concern. He was still standing there, the note in his hand, when he turned toward the driveway and noticed the old blue sedan parked along the side near the garage. It was Vivian's second car, the one she kept registered but rarely drove. He had almost forgotten it was there. He didn't understand why it was parked at an odd angle until he stepped closer and saw the condensation on the inside of the rear windows. The smear of a small hand on the glass. And pressed against the back window, barely visible in the dark, the outline of a child curled under something. Blankets, 2 of them, judging by the bulk. Too still to be awake, too small to be anything other than exactly who it was. Brennan crossed the remaining distance in 3 steps. He grabbed the door handle and pulled it open. The air that rolled out of the car was stale and cold, barely warmer than outside. The temperature inside the sedan had been sustained only by the minimal insulation of the metal body and whatever heat 2 thin blankets could hold against a November night. Noah lay across the back seat with his knees pulled to his chest, his shoes still tied, his face turned toward the seat cushion. His lips had gone pale. Not blue exactly, but close. Noah. The boy stirred. His fingers moved first, curling and uncurling slowly against the edge of the blanket. Then his eyes opened, unfocused, uncertain, blinking against the cold air that came through the open door. Dad! His voice was rough from sleep and from something else, a rawness that settled in the throat after crying. Brennan lifted him out of the car without another word. He pulled the boy against his chest and felt how cold the fabric of Noah's jacket was, how the child instinctively turned his face toward Brennan's neck the way he used to when he was much smaller. Brennan held him tight and walked to the front door and got them both inside. The house was cold and dim. The kitchen smelled of nothing, which meant nothing had been cooked in it recently. Brennan settled Noah on the living room couch, wrapped a blanket from the back of the armchair around his shoulders, and moved to the kitchen. He turned the stovetop burner on under a pot, found soup in the pantry, found hot chocolate mix in the back of the cabinet behind a box of crackers. He kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking right now would only slow him down. When the soup was warming, he leaned against the counter and looked at Noah through the kitchen doorway. "How long were you out there?" he asked. He kept his voice level, steady, the way he kept his voice when he was 40 feet up a frozen pole in the dark and needed his hands to stay calm. Noah looked down at his shoes. He traced a finger along the stitching on the couch cushion. 3 sleeps, he said quietly. Brennan set down the wooden spoon he was holding. 3 nights, he said. Noah nodded. Then, as if registering that the number itself might be a problem, he quickly added, "Grandma said I smell bad inside the house. She said it was better if I slept outside." He said it with the casual matter-of-factness of a child who has been told something enough times that it no longer fully registers as unusual. That was the thing that burned deepest. Not that it had been said once, but that Noah had clearly accepted it as a reasonable explanation. Brennan turned back to the stove. He stirred the soup. He breathed. Noah ate 2 full bowls and drank the hot chocolate in careful sips that eventually became less careful as the warmth returned to his face. Brennan sat across the table and watched and didn't push conversation. Noah volunteered nothing more for a while, and Brennan let the silence sit between them without trying to fill it. It was a useful silence, the kind that let a child feel safe before words were expected. Then Noah reached into the front pocket of his school backpack, which was sitting on the chair beside him, and placed a thick manila envelope on the table between them. When Grandma left, she forgot this on the counter. I thought maybe it was important papers. Brennan looked at the envelope. It was thick, the clasp bent, as if it had been opened and resealed more than once. He picked it up and opened it. He expected travel papers. He found a first booking confirmation for a hotel in Venice and almost set the envelope down. Then he saw the second layer. Bank statements for an account he had never seen. Opened 8 months ago, in Vivian's name only. The current balance showed $41,216. The deposits were irregular, drawn from the joint household account in amounts just small enough to avoid automatic flagging. 40 here, 70 there, occasionally 300 on months when larger household expenses could be used as cover. 8 months of quiet, patient, systematic removal. Property transfer forms. His name typed in the from line. The destination line pointing to a holding company he didn't recognize, which he would learn later was registered to Darlene through a third party in Cleveland. Screenshots of text messages printed on regular paper. Vivian to Darlene. Darlene to Vivian. Going back 11 months. And a printed email, the most recent, sent 6 weeks before Thanksgiving. Once Brennan signs the refinance papers after Christmas, we'll move the money and leave. The house will be mine before he even realizes what happened. Trent has the apartment ready. I've been patient long enough. He turned to the next page. Noah ruins everything. I'm tired of pretending to care about him. He's not mine, and he was never going to be mine, and I should never have agreed to this in the first place. Brennan kept reading. The plan for the divorce was thorough. Vivian would claim a pattern of financial abuse, that Brennan had controlled access to money, limited her spending, isolated her from economic independence. She would present the joint accounts as evidence that everything was in Brennan's name, omitting the fact that the arrangement had been mutual and agreed upon when they married. She would request full alimony, child support payments that included her biological daughter from a previous relationship who lived in another state and had not set foot in their home in over a year, and primary ownership of the house, pending a formal property division hearing. Trent Barlow appeared in 7 separate messages. An apartment in Rome. A confirmed flight departure. The note that Darlene had written by hand at the bottom of one of the printed pages. If the kid ends up in foster care, that's not our problem. He was never part of the plan. Brennan set the last page down on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. The soup pot on the stove had gone still. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and steady. Noah was watching him across the table with an expression that was too careful for a 7-year-old. Evaluating, measuring, trying to determine how the next few minutes were going to feel. Are you mad? He asked quietly. Brennan looked at his son. He looked at the careful eyes and the pale face and the backpack leaning against the chair leg and the boy who had slept 3 nights in a cold car and handed him the one document package that would change everything. He looked at all of that and felt something settle in him, slow and cold and absolute, that had no name he could easily put words to, but that felt, after the fear and the rage and the grief that had cycled through him in the last hour, like something very close to purpose. He folded the papers carefully, returned them to the envelope, and pressed the clasp closed. No, he said. He let a small, quiet smile cross his face, the first one all night. They just made a very big mistake. He put Noah to bed on the living room couch with every blanket he could find, tucked the edges in the way the boy liked them, and left the kitchen light on because Noah had never slept well in complete darkness. Then Brennan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee he had forgotten to drink and let himself think. Not plan. Not yet. First he had to think. He had met Vivian Cole 4 years ago at a birthday gathering for a mutual friend. She had been standing near the back of the room with a glass of wine, not working the party the way some people did, not performing sociability, just present in a way that seemed genuine. She was sharp and observant. She asked questions that weren't obvious. When he mentioned Noah, She didn't go stiff the way some women did at the news of a child from a previous relationship. She seemed interested, not in a performing interest way, but in a way that felt real. She asked how old he was, asked what he liked, laughed when Brennan described Noah's current obsession with earthworms. He had been raising Noah alone since the boy was 18 months old. Noah's mother had left without a note, without a forwarding address, without anything that held up as an explanation once Brennan was calm enough to examine the pieces. He had taken that apart and put it back together enough times over the years that it no longer hurt the same way, but it had left him careful. He didn't bring people close easily, and he didn't let anyone into Noah's life without real consideration. Vivian had seemed worth the consideration. In those early months, she was patient and warm. She called Noah our little guy in front of people without prompting. She brought him small gifts that showed she had actually paid attention to what he liked. Not generic child gifts, but specific ones. A book about deep-sea creatures because Brennan had mentioned Noah was obsessed with the ocean. A puzzle with unusual animals because Noah had said at dinner once that he liked animals that weren't famous. She sat with him when he was sick. She let him help in the kitchen on weekends in the way that small children help, which is to say inefficiently and with great enthusiasm, and she didn't make him feel like he was in the way. Brennan had told himself that this was real. He had believed it with the particular conviction of a man who had been careful for a long time and wanted to be done being careful. He married her 14 months after they met. The change was gradual enough that he almost missed it. Almost. It started with small verbal distances. She stopped calling Noah our little guy and started saying Brennan's kid. Not often, and not in front of Brennan directly, but he heard occasionally, in phone calls, in conversations with Darlene that carried through the wall of the upstairs hallway. He told himself it was a figure of speech. He told himself blended families took time. Then came the evening in the backseat of the car. Noah was 6, and they were driving home from a school event. And Noah was quiet in the way he got sometimes, sitting with something, turning it over. Brennan had asked him what he was thinking about. Noah looked out the window and said, very quietly, as if testing whether the words were allowed, "Grandma says I'm why Mommy stays angry." Brennan had pulled over. He turned around in his seat and looked at his son and asked where he had heard that. Noah shrugged in the careful way of a child who has realized he's said something significant. That night, Brennan brought it up with Vivian. She cried within 30 seconds of him opening the subject. Not soft crying. The pivot was too fast and too total for it to be anything other than practiced. Her voice broke on cue, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and said the words she always said when cornered. "You always choose him over me. I'm trying so hard, and you never see it. You make me feel like a monster when I'm doing everything I can. You have no idea how difficult this role is." And Brennan had backed down. He hated conflict inside his own home. He hated the particular feeling of a conversation that kept widening instead of resolving. He told himself the situation was complicated. Told himself he needed to be patient. Told himself that the right answer was to be better at communication, more attentive, more present when he wasn't working. He had been wrong. What he had actually been doing was choosing peace over protection over and over every time there was a choice between the two. And while he made that choice, his son was absorbing things that should never have reached a child's ears. He remembered a night in October, 8 months before Thanksgiving. He had come home early from a job in Dayton, unexpected, pulling into the driveway at 7 in the evening instead of 9. He had gone through the back door, which was closer from the driveway, and found the kitchen empty and the dining room lights on. Through the doorway, he could see Vivian and Darlene at the dining room table, takeout containers spread between them, laughing at something on a phone screen. He could hear music from the television in the next room. He didn't see Noah. He found him in the laundry room at the back of the house. The boy was sitting on the floor between the washer and the wall, eating dry cereal from a plastic sandwich bag, his back against the vibrating surface of the dryer that was running a load. He had a flashlight beside him and a library book open on his lap. He looked up when Brennan came in, and his expression went through 3 things in quick succession: surprise, relief, and then a kind of careful neutral that was too practiced for a 6-year-old to have invented on his own. "Hey, Dad." "Hey." Brennan kept his voice even. "Why are you eating in here?" Noah picked at the edge of the bag. Grandma said I chew too loud at the table. She said it was better if I ate in here when they were having their dinner. He said it the way Noah always said the difficult things, simply, without drama, as if the facts were the facts and adding emotion to them would only make things harder. Brennan had carried him to the dining room table and sat him down with a bowl and spoon and said nothing to Darlene or Vivian. Darlene smiled pleasantly and said the food was getting cold. Vivian said Noah really did chew loudly and it wasn't personal. Brennan had said nothing back. He had just sat with his son while the boy finished his meal, watching the two women pretend nothing had happened. He hadn't pushed it. He had told himself he would deal with it properly when the time was right. There was always going to be a right time later, a better conversation, a more settled moment. Sitting at the kitchen table at midnight on Thanksgiving, with the document envelope in front of him and his son asleep 10 feet away, Brennan understood exactly what all those postponed right times had cost. The guilt that settled into him was cold and heavy, and he didn't try to push it aside. He was a man who believed in carrying what he owed, and he owed his son a reckoning with this. So he sat with it, let it be what it was, and then watched it transform the way things do when a practical mind takes hold of them from guilt into focus. And focus for Brennan Cole was not a passive state. It was the beginning of action. He was at the bank when it opened at 9 the next morning. Noah's still asleep on the couch with a note on the kitchen table saying Brennan would be back before noon. He had left a bowl of cereal and a glass of orange juice on the table, covered with a plate to keep the cereal from going stale. He drove through Millbrook in the early morning gray, past the diner that was already busy with the post-Thanksgiving crowd, past the hardware store with its hand-painted holiday sale banner, through the intersection where the old movie theater had been before it became a pharmacy. He knew this town the way a man knows something he has never needed to think about consciously, by feel, by timing, by the rhythm of its streets. He sat in the bank manager's office and explained what he needed. He was calm. He did not editorialize or dramatize. He stated the situation, showed his identification and his account documentation, and asked for the freezes to be placed immediately on every joint account. The manager, a careful man named Gerald who had known Brennan's father, looked at him steadily for a moment and then began processing the requests without asking questions that weren't his business to ask. The house was something else entirely. Brennan's father had been a quiet man with strong opinions about two things: the quality of a man's work and the security of his property. When he was dying, cancer, the slow kind, 18 months from diagnosis, he had sat Brennan down in the kitchen of the same house and spoken with the seriousness he reserved for things that actually mattered. He told Brennan that the house was being left to him alone as a direct inheritance, and that it would be held in Brennan's name only. He said it was not a judgment about any future spouse, but a practical reality about the difference between shared assets and protected ones. He told Brennan that he had watched too many good men lose family property in bad divorces to let sentiment override legal structure. He said, "Property that is yours alone is the floor you stand on when everything else shifts." Brennan had listened. He had been 27 and freshly single, and the advice had felt overly cautious at the time. He had followed it anyway, because his father rarely spoke with that kind of weight behind his words, and when he did, it was worth listening. The house on Crestline Drive was legally his and his alone. Vivian's name appeared nowhere on the deed, the property tax records, or the mortgage that had since been paid off. She had never pressed the point, apparently assuming that marriage implied shared ownership, that the paperwork was a formality that would sort itself out. She had been wrong about that, completely and permanently wrong. He drove from the bank to Renee Holloway's office on the south side of town. Renee was known in Millbrook the way certain professionals become known in small towns, not through advertising, but through outcomes. She had taken on 3 high-conflict divorce cases in the past 5 years, all of them involving parties who had believed they had the upper hand, and she had dismantled those positions with a methodical precision that the local legal community had long since stopped being surprised by. She was compact and plainly dressed, and she had the particular quality of someone who was never performing confidence because she didn't need to. Her results were her introduction. She listened to Brennan for 35 minutes without interrupting. He laid the documents on her desk in the order he had found them and walked through each piece systematically. The bank statements, the property transfer forms, the printed messages, the email about the refinancing plan, the handwritten note at the bottom of Darlene's page about foster care. He showed her the photograph he had taken in the note taped to the front door. He showed her the timestamp on the photo, which established when he had arrived home. When he finished, Renee sat quietly for a moment, looking at the last document he had placed on her desk. They abandoned a 7-year-old child alone for 3 days, she said. Yes. Did you document what he looked like when you found him? Photographed him before I moved him. The timestamps are in the original files. Neighbor cameras on your street? At least 2 facing toward my driveway from different angles. I'll contact both homeowners today. Good. Renee looked at the documents one more time, because this won't stay a civil divorce case for very long. She outlined the legal scaffolding that needed to go up immediately. An emergency custody filing to formalize Brennan's sole authority over Noah while proceedings were open, a protective property notation to prevent any transfer attempts while the case was active, and a letter to opposing counsel establishing that any approach to the house or the account without authorization would be treated as contempt. Brennan signed where she pointed and asked the questions he needed answered and left the office an hour later with a folder of paperwork and a clear sense of the next 30 days. He sat in his truck in the parking lot and made the last call. The Child Protective Services intake line rang twice before someone answered. Brennan identified himself clearly. He gave Noah's full name and date of birth. He gave the address of the house. Then he described what had happened in order, without editorializing, using the same calm, precise voice he used when describing a problem to his senior engineer. He described the note on the door. He described the sedan and the temperature and the condensation on the windows. He described the color of Noah's lips when he woke him up. He described what Noah had told him about 3 nights. He described what Noah had said about Gramndma, telling him he smelled bad inside the house. He stayed on the line for 19 minutes. His voice never broke. His hands shook the entire time. The photographs began arriving on Brennan's phone 3 days after Thanksgiving. Wine glasses tilted toward a canal at sunset. A restaurant table spread with antipasto and bread and 2 glasses of something amber-colored. A selfie taken in front of a cathedral with scaffolding visible in the background. Vivian leaning into the frame, smiling the particular smile she used in photographs, the one that was designed rather than felt. Trent Barlow appeared in 2 of the pictures, standing slightly behind her, taller than Brennan had imagined, wearing a linen shirt despite the December cold in a way that seemed less like comfort and more like an image he was maintaining. Brennan looked at each photograph once and set his phone face down on the kitchen counter. Not once across any of those messages did Vivian mention Noah. Not a single question about how the boy was doing, whether he had eaten, whether he was warm, whether he had asked for her. Not one word to indicate that she understood or cared that she had left a 7-year-old in a car in November and gotten on a plane to Europe. The silence around Noah's name had its own kind of shape, and Brennan recorded it carefully alongside everything else. By the end of the first week, the photographs stopped. Vivian's credit card began declining. The first projection came at a restaurant in Venice, which Vivian explained away as a temporary system error. The second came the following afternoon at a boutique hotel near the Rialto, where the weekly reservation payment failed 3 times in automated sequence before the front desk called her room. The third came at a pharmacy, which was perhaps the most humiliating because the amount was small enough that declining it was purely a statement. Every joint account connected to Brennan's income had been frozen. The secondary account Vivian had spent 8 months quietly filling had been flagged as part of the protective filing. The house she had intended to leverage as her financial foundation was legally untouchable. The entire infrastructure she and Darlene had built over the course of a year had been disassembled quietly and completely from a house in Ohio while she was ordering wine in Venice. Trent, who had understood from Vivian that money was not going to be a problem, found that his understanding required significant revision. He was a practical man in the specific way that men who use other people as investments tend to be practical. He had agreed to a 50-50 arrangement on the trip's expenses based on Vivian's representation of her financial position. When her cards started declining and her explanations became less convincing with each repetition, he began recalculating. "You told me your husband had money," he said one evening in the narrow hallway of the rented apartment they had moved into after the hotel became an issue. His voice was not cruel. It was simply the voice of someone closing a door. "He does," Vivian said. "Something is wrong with the transfers. Give me a few more days." "You said a few more days 3 times. It's being handled." Trent looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has already made their decision and is simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. He said nothing more that night. 2 days later, he packed his carry-on and told her he hoped things worked out. He didn't look back. Back in Millbrook, the CPS investigation had begun moving at its own steady pace. A caseworker named Patricia Owens visited Noah at school on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December. She had been doing this work for 16 years, and she knew how to create the particular kind of quiet that let children speak without feeling observed. She sat across from Noah in the school counselor's office with a cup of juice on the table between them and let him set the pace. Noah talked. He talked in the careful, unhurried way he did most things, as if he had been turning the memories over for a long time and was now ready to set them down. He told Patricia about sleeping in the car, about counting the cracks in the sedan's ceiling to pass the time, about how on the second night it got cold enough that he put both blankets over his head and breathed under them to make a warm pocket, the way he'd read about in a survival book from the school library, about how on the third morning he ate the last granola bar from his backpack and then sat very still for a long time, because moving made him think about how hungry he was. He told her about the meals in the laundry room, and about being told he chewed too loudly, and about the time Darlene grabbed his arm hard enough to leave a mark because he knocked over a glass of juice. He showed Patricia the faint discoloration still visible on his left wrist. He told her, in a voice that didn't waver, that Vivian had once said, when she thought he was asleep in the other room, that she wished she had never agreed to play house with someone else's damaged kid. He said he didn't know what damaged meant exactly, but that he knew it wasn't good. Patricia Owens excused herself after the interview ended. She stood in the hallway outside the counselor's office with her notepad against her chest and closed her eyes for 2 full minutes before she wrote a single word. Vivian flew back to Ohio on a Friday, 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. She came through arrivals at Columbus Airport carrying her suitcase and her composure, both of them slightly worse for the journey. She had spent the transatlantic flight composing herself, running through the version of events she intended to present, the one where she was a woman who had reached her limit after years of quiet suffering and had simply, understandably, needed to get away. She had her attorney on the phone before the taxi reached the highway. She had the framework of her argument organized by the time she reached the hotel she had booked for the week. She could not go to the house on Crestline Drive. That had been made clear through Renee Holloway's initial letter to Gerald Fitch, Vivian's attorney. The property was under a protective notation, and Vivian had no legal standing to access it without a formal arrangement. She had read the letter twice with the particular expression of someone who had not expected the other party to have a lawyer this organized. The first hearing was in family court on a Tuesday morning, a preliminary session meant to establish temporary arrangements. Vivian arrived in soft gray and something close to ivory, her expression arranged into a careful, studied fragility that read, from a distance, as sincerity. She had the posture of someone who had rehearsed their presentation. Gerald Fitch sat beside her looking unhurried, which was a professional manner he maintained regardless of how good or bad his actual position was. Fitch opened by building the version of events Vivian had hired him to build. He described Brennan as chronically emotionally absent, a man whose work schedule had left his wife isolated and without genuine support for years. He characterized the Italy trip as a reasonable response to accumulated emotional strain, the action of a woman seeking space and perspective, not the action of someone indifferent to her family's welfare. He argued that Vivian had been a stabilizing presence in Noah's life, that Brennan's account of events was colored by the adversarial nature of the proceedings, and that the child had been coached to support his father's narrative. He requested temporary alimony, temporary child support, and temporary exclusive residential access to the house. Then Renee Holloway stood up. She had a file folder in front of her and a yellow legal pad with organized notes, and she presented the evidence the way a structural engineer presents load calculations, methodically, without drama, piece by piece, letting the weight speak for itself. She submitted Brennan's photograph of Noah's pale face in the backseat of the car, time-stamped at 9:47 on Thanksgiving night. She submitted the written note from the door in Vivian's own handwriting, with the phrase "your son" underlined in the filing summary. She submitted security footage from a neighbor across the street, showing the blue sedan motionless in the driveway for 72 consecutive hours with no adult approaching the vehicle. She submitted Noah's school attendance records from the prior 8 months, recurring late arrivals, 2 documented instances of teachers providing food from classroom supplies because the child appeared hungry, 1 teacher notation about unexplained bruising. She submitted the printed messages and the email about the refinancing scheme, including the timeline and the references to Trent and the apartment in Rome. She submitted Patricia Owens's written summary of the school interview with Noah. And then she played 15 seconds of audio from a voice message Darlene had left for a friend 6 weeks before Thanksgiving. The recording was clear. Darlene's voice was unmistakable. The word she used to describe Noah was deadweight. The courtroom went very quiet. Vivian's careful expression fractured. Not all at once, gradually, like a surface that has been under too much pressure for too long. Her eyes moved to Fitch, who had gone still in the way of a man recalculating rather than a man panicking. He leaned toward Vivian and said something low. She shook her head slightly. Judge Walter Greer had been on the family court bench for 19 years. He had seen virtually every form of marital dishonesty that human beings were capable of producing. He was not easily surprised, and he was not easily moved to visible reaction. But when he looked up from the evidence summary in front of him, his expression had settled into something colder than his usual neutral. "Mrs. Cole," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that means someone has decided not to use their full volume. "You abandoned child." Vivian opened her mouth, then closed it, "and you attempted to access and transfer property with no legal basis for doing so, through a scheme you had been planning for nearly a year." Fitch leaned toward Vivian again. She ignored him. "My mother encouraged me," she said. "I was in a very difficult emotional state. She told me Brennan had been hiding money and that I had a right to protect myself. I was following her advice." In the gallery behind the bar, Darlene, who had come to observe the session, shifted in her seat. The judge did not look at Darlene. "That's an interesting defense," he said. He did not sound interested. Within the next 40 minutes, Vivian's alimony request was denied. Her residential access request was denied. Emergency sole custody was formally documented in Brennan's name, with a supervised contact order attached that required any future visitation to be pre-approved, monitored, and reviewed on a case-by-case basis. The judge made a specific notation at the bottom of the temporary order and sent a copy that afternoon to the district attorney's office. Vivian left the courtroom walking beside Fitch, her face set. She did not look at Brennan as she passed. She did not look at anyone in the gallery. Brennan gathered his documents, thanked Renee quietly, and sat in the plaintiff's chair until the room was empty. Then he picked up his folder and walked out into the pale December sunlight and stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting the cold air settle around him. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel relieved. He felt like a man who had done the first part of the necessary work and understood there was more still to do. He drove home to his son. That evening, Brennan made dinner for the two of them. Pasta from the pantry, a red sauce he had made from canned tomatoes and garlic and dried basil, garlic bread onto the broiler. Nothing complicated. The kind of meal that a kitchen could produce on short notice and that a 7-year-old would actually eat without negotiation. He kept the television off. The house was quiet in the particular way it had been for the past 2.5 weeks, a quietness that felt different from the silence of before. Cleaner, steadier. Noah ate most of his plate and then sat with his fork, pushing a piece of garlic bread around the bowl without eating it. This was the tell Brennan had learned to read. The boy who ate through distraction was carrying something he hadn't found the right moment for yet. "Whatever you're turning over in your head," Brennan said from across the table, "you can say it." Noah looked up. He set the fork down. He folded his hands on the table in the unconscious imitation of Brennan's own habit that had developed somewhere in the past year. And Brennan felt something in his chest move at the sight of it. "When you worked away," Noah began. He was choosing his words carefully, the way he did when something mattered too much to say sloppily. "Mommy used to tell me that if I said stuff about what happened at home, you would stop loving me. She said you already had a lot of reasons not to come back, and I shouldn't give you any more." Brennan kept his expression steady. He kept his hands flat on the table. "She said that more than once?" he asked. "Lots of times." Noah paused. "She said if I was a problem, you'd put me somewhere else, like a different family. She said you already had enough trouble without me making more." The kitchen held that quietly. Brennan thought about a 7-year-old boy in the back of a cold sedan, counting ceiling cracks in the dark, carrying the additional weight of believing that telling his father the truth would be the thing that finally drove his father away. He thought about how long Noah had been managing that alone. Not just the cold nights, not just the meals in the laundry room, not just the unkind words, but the belief, carefully constructed and consistently reinforced, that love was conditional and his was barely holding. He was building his response when Noah reached into the front pocket of his backpack and placed a small rectangular device on the table between them. A voice recorder, the inexpensive pocket kind, with a small orange indicator light and a clip on the back. "Grandma left it on the kitchen counter when she was packing," Noah said. "I put it in my bag. I thought maybe it was important." Brennan picked it up. He pressed play. The audio had some background noise, television or radio, plus the ambient hum of a kitchen. But the voices were clear enough. He recognized both immediately. Vivian first, her voice carrying the casual ease of someone speaking without any expectation of being heard by anyone who mattered. "Once we get the house sold, Brennan can fight for scraps. He'll be working 60 hours a week to pay for an attorney, and he won't have time to be a problem." Then Darlene, laughing, "And if Noah gets taken by the state, maybe Brennan will stop pretending he's some kind of perfect father. Reality check would do him good." Vivian again, "Noah is the only reason any of this is complicated. Without him, Brennan would have moved on by now, and none of this would be necessary." More laughter. Comfortable, familiar, the laughter of two people who have had this conversation many times. Brennan pressed stop. He set the recorder down on the table between them and sat with it for a moment. The kitchen light was warm. Outside, the snow had started again, light and soft, tapping quietly at the window above the sink. Noah was watching him with the patient, waiting eyes that had seen too much and said too little for too long. Something settled in Brennan that had no precise name. It wasn't rage, because he was past the temperature of rage. Rage was hot and imprecise, and it burned through itself quickly. This was something colder and more permanent, the specific, complete, final certainty of a man who now understood everything and had exactly what he needed. He looked at his son. "You were never a problem," Brennan said. His voice was even and direct. "Not for one day. Not in any version of any story anyone ever told you. Do you understand me? Those were lies. All of them. Deliberate lies told by people who needed you to stay quiet." Noah listened to this carefully. He turned it over the way he turned everything over. Then he nodded once. "Okay," he said softly. The word was small, but the way he said it, like a door closing on something he didn't need to carry anymore, was the most important thing Brennan had heard in months. He called Renee Holloway from the back porch 15 minutes later, standing in the snow in his socks, keeping his voice low. "I have a voice recording," he told her. "Both of them, Vivian and Darlene together. You need to hear what's on it." A beat of silence on the line. "Bring it in tomorrow morning," she said. First thing, he went back inside, washed the dishes, and sat on the couch beside Noah while the boy fell asleep watching a nature documentary about ocean creatures. When the boy's breathing evened out, Brennan turned the volume down and sat in the quiet with the recorder on the cushion beside him. He didn't feel the satisfaction some people might have expected him to feel. He felt like a man who had everything he needed and knew precisely what to do with it. That was enough. The district attorney's office moved faster than anyone expected. The case had arrived on their desk with an unusual completeness. Not a partial account requiring investigation to fill the gaps, but a fully assembled picture supported by physical evidence, documented records, an independent CPS report, corroborating statements from multiple witnesses, and a voice recording in which the defendants had essentially narrated their own intentions. The DA's team reviewed the package in 2 days and filed charges on the third. Vivian and Darlene each faced 4 counts: child abandonment, child endangerment, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, and attempted coercion in connection with the property transfer scheme. The charges were not symbolic. Each one carried meaningful sentencing exposure, and together they amounted to the kind of legal situation that a good attorney might chip at the edges of, but could not make disappear. Millbrook followed the case the way small towns follow things that involve people everyone has known for years. Not with pleasure, exactly, but with the particular attention of a community processing the difference between who someone appeared to be and who they turn out to be. The neighbor 2 houses down from Brennan came forward without being contacted. She had heard Noah crying outside on at least 4 occasions over the past year, always late at night, always from the direction of the driveway or the backyard. She had assumed normal childhood upset each time. A bad dream, a disagreement, the ordinary distress of childhood, and had gone back to sleep. Now she sat at her kitchen table and gave a statement to investigators and said she felt sick about the assumptions she had made. 2 of Noah's teachers submitted written accounts. The first described the morning last spring when Noah had come in with a bruise along his left forearm and explained it as a door. She had logged it as a precaution, but had not escalated it, and she had regretted that for months without fully understanding why until the CPS investigation made the pattern visible. The second teacher had been at a school event where Darlene attended as a family representative. She had seen Noah flinch, a sharp, involuntary, full-body flinch, when Darlene put a hand on his shoulder in greeting. She had filed it away and moved on. She submitted her account now, without being asked. Members of Vivian's church circle, interviewed separately by investigators, described the same potluck dinner from different perspectives. Darlene had made a remark about Noah being a broken kid at a dinner table full of people who had laughed or smiled or said nothing, because it had been delivered in the light tone of someone sharing a harmless frustration. Each of them, sitting across from an investigator weeks later, described the same memory with the same expression, the slow dawning recognition that they had let something pass because it had been wrapped in the right packaging. Brennan gave his own statement on a gray Tuesday morning in January, sitting in a conference room at the DA's office with Renee beside him. He answered every question directly and completely. He did not perform emotion or withhold it artificially. He simply described what had happened, in the order it had happened, without editorializing. When an investigator asked him how he felt about the situation now that charges have been filed, Brennan looked at her across the table. "I feel like I should have protected my son sooner," he said. "Everything else is just paperwork." He never gave interviews to the local paper, though a reporter called twice. He never posted anything publicly about the case. He never spoke to the neighbors and church acquaintances who reached out with what amounted to social curiosity dressed as concern. He let the truth move at its own speed, which was fast and in one direction. Gerald Fitch issued a brief public statement calling the charges disproportionate. 2 weeks after filing it, he quietly withdrew from the case, citing a scheduling conflict that no one believed. Vivian's new attorney was younger, less experienced, and had a considerably more limited track record in court. He was also, by the time he arrived, working with significantly less material to work with. The image Vivian had spent 3 years constructing, the patient stepmother, the warm presence at school events, the woman who always said the right things to the right people, had been replaced by its actual contents. And the process of replacement, once started, was not something she could slow from the outside. The final divorce hearing came on the second Monday of March. The snow had stopped by then. Millbrook had been cold and gray and closed in all winter, and the morning of the hearing had a quality to it that the town hadn't had in months. A tentative mildness, the first thin green along the highway median, a sky that was overcast but lighter than it had been. Whether the weather was making a deliberate comment was impossible to say, but Brennan noticed it on the drive to the courthouse and said nothing, which was how he handled most things that felt significant. Vivian was already seated when he entered the courtroom. He saw her from across the room and took a moment to look at her without expression. She looked different, thinner. The careful presentation was gone, replaced by something more functional and less performed. She sat straight in her chair with the careful posture of a person who has decided that visible defeat is not an option, even if the internal version has already arrived. Her attorney, Derek Holt, sat beside her organizing papers with the focused efficiency of a man who has been paid to do his best and intends to do it regardless of what he has to work with. Holt's closing argument lasted 22 minutes. He built it around the framework of emotional distress, poor counsel from a controlling parent, and the absence of prior criminal history. He acknowledged that the abandonment had been wrong, and said Vivian acknowledged that also. He asked for consideration of the counseling Vivian had voluntarily begun. He asked for proportionality. He spoke carefully and professionally, and without any obvious sense that he believed what he was saying would actually work. Vivian addressed the court herself near the end. She said she was sorry. She said it several times, in slightly different arrangements, with different emphasis in different places. She said she had not meant for Noah to be hurt. She said she had been under more strain than anyone could see from the outside, and that she had made choices she couldn't take back, but hoped the court would weigh against the context in which they were made. She said she had genuinely cared about Noah at one point, and that she wished things had gone differently. She looked at Brennan once during this. A brief, direct look, held for perhaps 2 seconds before she turned back to the judge. Brennan looked back at her without expression. Judge Walter Greer had reviewed a full winter's worth of evidence. He had read the CPS report in its entirety, the criminal inquiry summary, and assessments from 2 independent child welfare evaluators who had each interviewed Noah separately and arrived at consistent conclusions. He had been on the family court bench for 19 years and had reviewed thousands of cases, and he had developed, over that time, a particular economy of language when delivering rulings that he had already fully formed. He was quiet for one moment after both attorneys sat. Then he began. No alimony. Denied in full. No legitimate basis for the request in light of the documented financial misconduct and the absence of economic disadvantage attributable to the marriage. No child support claim. Custody was being determined as sole and exclusive to the father, rendering the support claim without standing. Property confirmed as Brennan Cole's sole possession under the inheritance documentation, not subject to division. Full permanent custody of Noah Cole granted to the father with immediate effect. Permanent protective order issued against both Vivian Cole and Darlene Cole, prohibiting direct or indirect contact with Noah without specific judicial authorization. And then the final section. Due to the deliberate and premeditated nature of the abandonment, the documented pattern of emotional harm to the child, and the organized financial fraud scheme, the court was ordering mandatory counseling as a minimum condition for any future application for supervised visitation. Any such application would not be considered until after the criminal sentencing process was complete and a minimum period of supervised rehabilitation had been concluded. The criminal sentence, when imposed, would include incarceration. Vivian stood up. She was not crying this time. She was shouting. Her voice was raw and uneven, and she said Brennan's name the way people say names when they want to throw them. Said he had manipulated everyone. Said the system had been used against her. Said she was the real victim of a calculated campaign. Said that Noah would understand someday, when he was old enough to think for himself. Said several more things that were absorbed by the room and changed nothing in it. The bailiff moved toward her at a measured pace. Judge Greer watched her from the bench without changing expression. Brennan watched her from the plaintiff's table without changing expression. Derek Holt put his hand on her arm and said something in a quiet, firm voice. She pulled away from him. Then, after another moment, the energy left her the way it does when a person finally runs out of the thing that was holding it up. She sat down. Her hands went over her face. The sound she made was not the controlled crying she had used in earlier hearings. It was something rawer and more private. The sound of someone who has finally arrived at the place they were always going to arrive at, and found it exactly as bad as they feared. The judge called the next item on the docket, and the courtroom moved on. Brennan sat until the room cleared. Then he picked up his folder and walked out into the March morning. Renee walked beside him and said something about next steps that he registered and filed away for later. He thanked her. They shook hands at the top of the courthouse steps. Then he got in his truck and drove to Noah's school, where a note from Renee's office had already been delivered authorizing him to pick the boy up early for a special occasion. Noah came out of the building with his backpack and his fishing hat. He had started wearing it everywhere in recent weeks, and climbed into the passenger seat and looked at his father. "How did it go?" "The way it was supposed to," Brennan said. Noah nodded and put his feet up on the dash the way he knew he wasn't supposed to, and Brennan let it go, and they drove to get burgers and milkshakes without discussing the details further. Some victories don't need narration. They just need to be felt. Darlene was processed at county intake on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. She arrived with the posture of someone who has decided that the best available response to an inescapable situation is to treat it as an indignity beneath them. She was brisk with the intake officers. She asked to speak to a supervisor twice in the first 30 minutes and was told twice that one was unavailable. She complained about the intake procedures. She complained about the clothing. She sat down in the holding area with the expression of a woman waiting for a mistake to be recognized and corrected. In her first week, she talked. She talked to other women in the unit, to the correctional officer who did the morning count, to a chaplain who stopped by on Wednesday afternoons. She told all of them the same version. Her daughter had been taken advantage of by a calculating husband. The evidence had been manufactured or misread. The child had been coached. The legal system had failed to understand the complexity of the situation. She said this calmly and with conviction, the way a person does when they have told a story so many times that it has begun to feel like memory. No one pushed back. No one validated her either. The other women had their own situations and their own grievances, and none of them had patience for someone whose main complaint seemed to be that she'd been caught. The correctional officer did her count and moved on. The chaplain listened politely and said very little. By the second week, the talking slowed. By the third week, Darlene was quieter than she had perhaps ever been in her adult life. She ate her meals without commentary. She sat in the common area in the evenings and stared at a point on the wall that no one else could see. The arithmetic was slow and clearly painful, but it was happening. She sent a letter to Vivian in the fourth week. The letter was long and in places almost coherent, but its central argument was the one Darlene would always return to because it was the one she genuinely believed. Not everything that had gone wrong was her fault. Vivian had wanted the same things Darlene had helped her plan for. Vivian had made her own choices and should not be permitted to reframe them as victimization at this late stage. Vivian read the letter in a visitation room in her own facility, sitting at a metal table with a cup of institutional coffee she wasn't drinking. She read it once through and then set it down and stared at it for a long time. The letter was right as far as it went. Vivian had wanted those things. She had wanted the money in the apartment in Rome and the clean break from a life she had grown bored with. She had chosen to follow her mother's advice because her mother's advice had confirmed what she already wanted to believe. Every cruelty toward Noah had begun as a small thing that felt justified, and Darlene had been there each time to reinforce the justification, to make the resentment feel reasonable, to make a 7-year-old child's presence in the household feel like an imposition rather than a life. But the letter was also wrong in the way Darlene's logic was always wrong. It treated Vivian's complicity as an excuse for Darlene's involvement rather than as a separate fact that existed alongside it. Darlene had not been an innocent advisor. She had been an architect. The distinction mattered. Vivian put the letter in the bin beside the table and picked up her coffee. Brennan felt no pity for either of them. He was not angry anymore. Anger had burned out somewhere in the middle of January, replaced by the focused, useful energy of action. He was not bitter, because bitterness required ongoing attention, and he had better uses for his attention. He simply felt nothing toward Vivian and Darlene that he considered worth examining. They had done what they had done. The law had responded. Noah was safe. The chapter was closed. Some damage cannot be undone, and the people who cause it do not deserve the energy it would take to forgive them. That was not coldness. That was clarity. Brennan had come to understand the difference. The cabin near Lake Erie had belonged to Brennan's father, and before that to his father's older brother. And before that it was simply a piece of land at the edge of the water that a practical man in an earlier generation had decided to put something sturdy on. It wasn't much from the outside, weathered wood siding, a narrow porch facing the water, a dock that needed one new board replaced every season and got it. The interior was small and efficient. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that worked, a main room with a couch that had seen better decades, and a wood stove that still did its job perfectly. The view from the front porch on a clear evening was worth everything the cabin was not. Brennan had grown up spending summers here. He had learned to fish from this dock. He had learned to swim in this lake. He had sat on this porch with his father on evenings very much like the ones that were coming now, watching the light change over the water and saying nothing because the light didn't need comment. He had brought Noah here once before, 2 summers back for a long weekend. Noah had talked about it for months afterward. The fishing, the bike rides, the grilled corn, the particular quality of the quiet near water. He had described it to his teacher when the class was asked to write about a happy place. He had drawn a picture of the dock for the refrigerator at home, a child's drawing with too much blue, and a stick figure holding a fishing rod that Brennan had kept without saying much about it. They arrived in late June, 2 days after Noah's school year ended. They packed the truck the night before, a cooler with food and drinks, Noah's fishing gear in a canvas bag. He had organized himself with great seriousness. Lures sorted by type, line checked for tangles, the new hook kit in a Ziploc bag so the pieces didn't scatter. Brennan's fishing gear was less organized and more experienced. A sleeping bag each, books, a deck of cards, the bare minimum of everything that mattered and none of what didn't. The drive took just under 4 hours through the flat green landscape of northern Ohio, the highway lined with corn that was already knee-high in the June warmth. They listened to a radio station that played older country music and talked about things that mattered in the way only the most relaxed conversations do, without stakes, without direction. They argued about whether a person could learn to whistle properly through practice or whether it was just something you either had. Noah was firm. It was innate. Brennan disagreed. Anything could be learned with enough repetition. Noah tried to demonstrate a whistle to support his position. It came out as a wet, shapeless sound. He looked at Brennan. Brennan looked at him. Then they both laughed, the genuine kind, the kind that doesn't need a prompt. They argued about it contentedly for 40 more miles without resolving anything, which was the right outcome. The cabin was exactly as Brennan had left it in the previous fall, slightly dusty, smelling of lake air and old wood and the faint cedar from the closet in the back room. He opened every window and the screen door and let the June air move through while Noah dropped his bag on the bedroom floor and immediately went to check the dock. The far post looks crooked, Noah reported from a window over the kitchen sink. It's been crooked for 6 years, Brennan told him. It's not going anywhere. Noah considered this with the expression of a small engineer and apparently found it structurally acceptable because he went outside. The days settled into their own rhythm with the ease of a place that has been doing what it does long enough to know how. Mornings meant coffee for Brennan and cereal for Noah, and then fishing from the dock, which produced more conversation than fish and was the better for it. They talked about whatever came to mind, animals they'd seen on the nature documentaries they'd been watching all spring, whether fish could feel boredom, what the lake looked like in winter, whether the far shore was technically Ohio, or if there was a line somewhere in the middle of the water. Afternoons meant Noah on his bike. He had a particular relationship with that bike. He rode it the way some children run, with a focused physical joy that looked like it was burning something clean. He went for miles sometimes, coming back with his face flushed and his eyes bright, and a general air of having used himself completely, which was exactly what a child needed after the kind of year he had been through. Evenings meant cooking outside. Brennan ran the small charcoal grill on the side of the cabin, burgers and corn mostly, the smoke rising clean and straight in the still lake air. Noah set the table on the porch, which meant 1 napkin each and the salt shaker that leaked slightly and the metal cups they had used since Brennan was a child. They ate outside and watched the light move across the water and did not talk about anything that had happened between November and March. Not because they were avoiding it, just because there was nothing left in it worth carrying to the lake. There was no yelling. There were no locked doors. No meals eaten alone in back rooms. No lying in the dark, counting things to make the hours pass. No measured words. No calculated silences. No bracing for what the next hour might bring. On the fourth evening, they were sitting on the porch after dinner, the sun moving toward the horizon in the slow, specific way it does over water, stretching the light rather than simply losing it. Noah had his feet up on the porch railing, shoes off, his fishing hat pushed back. He had a piece of grass he was turning between his fingers, watching the lake. He was quiet for a while, the contented kind of quiet. Then, without looking away from the water, he said, "Do you think Mom ever loved me?" The question was simple and direct, without self-pity or drama, the way Noah asked the things he had actually been thinking about for a while. He asked it the way he asked whether fish could feel boredom, because he genuinely wanted to know what the most honest answer was, and because he trusted that Brennan would give him one. Brennan looked out at the water. The light was orange gold now, the kind that only holds for about 15 minutes before it shifts. He considered the question honestly, the way it deserved to be considered. "I think she loved herself more than anybody else," he said. "More than me. More than you. More than anyone she ever stood next to. And when loving herself wasn't enough anymore, she needed someone to blame for it. That was never about you. That was about who she already was before she ever met you." Noah was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Okay," he said, not dismissively, thoughtfully, the way he processed things that actually shifted something in him. He turned his head and looked at Brennan. "She was wrong about you, by the way," he said. "She told me you'd leave if things got hard enough. She was wrong about that." Brennan met his eyes. "Yeah," he said simply. "She was." Noah turned back to the lake and smiled. It was a small, private smile, the kind that doesn't ask for acknowledgement or response. It stayed on his face while the light finished its shift and the water went from gold to gray to silver, and the first stars appeared one by one above the dark line of the far shore. A little while later, Noah went inside, said good night, and pulled his bedroom door most of the way closed the way he liked it. Not latched, just resting. Brennan stayed on the porch. He sat in the dark with the lake in front of him and let himself think about the last 8 months from the beginning. The frozen poles in Indiana. The dark drive home through the snow. The porch light off. The note in Vivian's handwriting. The pale face in the back seat. 3 sleeps. He thought about the envelope Noah had quietly saved and handed over at the kitchen table. About the voice recorder that a 7-year-old had put in his backpack because he thought maybe it was important. About every small, deliberate, careful act his son had performed in the middle of a situation that would have crushed most adults, let alone a child. He thought about Renee Holloway's conference room and the DA's office and Judge Greer's voice delivering the ruling in a nearly empty courtroom on a Monday morning in March. He thought about what his father had told him at this same kitchen table in a different year. The floor you stand on when everything else shifts. The dock light was on, casting a small yellow circle on the black water. Somewhere beyond the circle, something moved and broke the surface and was gone. A fish. A piece of debris. The lake doing what the lake did, indifferent to the stories told on the shore. Brennan had never been interested in revenge, not in the way people sometimes expected him to be. Revenge required a target and an audience and an ongoing performance of grievance that he had no patience for. What he had wanted was simpler and more difficult. Truth, recognized by people with authority. Consequences applied to people who had earned them. Safety, rebuilt around a boy who deserved to stop being afraid in his own home. He had those things now. The court case was closed. The charges had been filed and the rulings had been delivered, and the 2 women who had spent a year quietly working to strip him of his home, his finances, and his son had found out what happened when a careful, unyielding man decided to respond. But none of that was the victory. The victory was inside the cabin behind him. Asleep in a cabin he had first visited 2 summers ago and talked about for months afterward. Wearing a fishing hat he had started wearing everywhere. With a small smile, still perhaps on his face from a conversation about love and truth on a porch over a lake in June. Brennan sat on the porch until the last light in the nearest cabin went off down the road. Then he went inside. He checked on Noah, who was asleep on his back with one arm thrown over his face the way he always slept. He pulled the blanket up a few inches and turned off the hall light. Then he went to his own room and lay down and listened to the lake settle into its night sounds. Water moving against the dock pilings, something in the trees, the far-off call of something he couldn't identify. It was enough. It was more than enough.